The sky was wrong. That's what I remember most about my first day arriving at Forward Operating Base Mercy near the Kuwait-Iraq border in January 1991. The thick, black smoke from the oil fires had turned the desert sky into an eternal twilight. The sun, when visible at all, hung like a bloodshot eye through the haze, casting an otherworldly red glow across the sand. I'd been deployed as part of the Canadian Medical Support Unit, fresh out of my final rotation at Toronto General. Nothing in my training prepared me for what I saw when our convoy rolled through those gates. The base had been hastily assembled around an abandoned school building, its concrete walls still bearing scorch marks from artillery fire. The structure squatted against the horizon like a wounded animal, its windows dark and empty. "Welcome to the edge of hell, Lieutenant Morrison," Major Williams said as I stepped down from the transport vehicle. He was a weathered man with deep lines etched around his eyes, though he couldn't have been older than 45. "The building's not much, but it's what we've got to work with." The air tasted like copper and petroleum. Every breath felt heavy, contaminated. My boots sank slightly into the sand as I followed Major Williams toward the building, watching other medical personnel unloading equipment from the trucks. The sound of distant explosions punctuated the desert wind, each one making me flinch slightly. The major didn't seem to notice them anymore. Inside, the school's hallways had been transformed into makeshift hospital wards. The smell of industrial disinfectant couldn't quite mask the underlying odors of mold and decay. Our footsteps echoed off the tiles, creating an unsettling percussion that seemed to follow us as we walked. "You'll be working primarily with Dr. Thompson," Major Williams explained, leading me toward what had once been the school's gymnasium. "He's one of our best surgeons, but..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Well, let's just say his last deployment left some marks." Dr. Thompson was organizing supplies when we found him. He was tall and rail-thin, with prematurely gray hair and hands that never seemed to stop moving. When he turned to greet us, I noticed his eyes were different colors, one brown, one a pale, almost colorless blue. "Heterochromia," he said, catching my glance. "Though this one," he pointed to the pale eye, "wasn't always this way. Shrapnel incident in Bosnia. Interesting case, actually. The metal fragment carried a unique bacterial strain that caused localized depigmentation." He spoke rapidly, his words tumbling over each other like stones in a river. I was then introduced to Nurse Reynolds, a veteran of 3 combat deployments who moved through the chaos with an almost supernatural calm. She was showing a young medic, Corporal Baker, how to set up the triage stations. Baker couldn't have been more than 20, with a baby face that made him look even younger. He kept glancing nervously at the windows, though I couldn't tell if he was more afraid of what might come through them or the perpetual twilight outside. "You'll want to get settled quickly," Nurse Reynolds advised me, her voice carrying a slight maritime accent. "We're expecting the first wave of casualties within 48 hours. Coalition forces are pushing forward, and we're the closest medical facility to several key engagement zones." That first afternoon was spent setting up our equipment and converting classrooms into specialized treatment areas. The school's architecture felt wrong somehow. Angles that seemed to bend in unusual ways. Corridors that felt longer walking one direction than they did returning. I blamed it on fatigue and disorientation from the time zone changes. It wasn't until evening that we experienced our first strange incident. I was helping to set up the radio equipment in what had once been the administrative office when we picked up an unusual transmission. At first, it was just static, but then voices emerged, speaking what sounded like Arabic, but played backwards. Dr. Thompson, who was passing by, stopped dead in his tracks when he heard it. "Turn that off," he snapped, his pale eye seeming to catch the fluorescent light in an unnatural way. "Now." Before I could reach for the dial, the voices changed. They became deeper, overlapping, creating a cacophony that made my teeth ache. Through the static, I could have sworn I heard crying. Not normal crying, but the kind of wailing that makes your soul shrivel. The radio exploded in a shower of sparks, making us all jump back. When we examined it later, we found its internal components had melted, though there was no apparent power surge or technical malfunction that could explain it. "Get some rest while you can," Dr. Thompson advised, though he wouldn't meet my eyes. "Tomorrow, the real work begins." He hesitated at the door, his hand trembling slightly as he gripped the frame. "And Lieutenant, if you hear those voices again, don't listen. Don't ever listen." That night, as I lay on my cot in the female officers' quarters, the wind howled through the building's empty spaces. The sound reminded me of the radio voices and I pulled my blanket tighter despite the heat. Through my window, I could see the oil fire smoke blotting out the stars, making the night absolute. In that darkness, I could have sworn I saw shapes, moving human-like figures that seemed to dance and twist in impossible ways. But when I blinked and looked harder, there was nothing there except the smoke and that blood-red moon hanging low and malevolent over the desert. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did. The wind kept howling, and somewhere in the building, something was scratching at the walls. We told ourselves it was just the sand against the windows, the natural sounds of an old building settling. We were wrong. God, we were so wrong. The casualties began arriving at dawn, though you could hardly call it dawn in that perpetual twilight. The first helicopters descended through the smoke like prehistoric birds, their rotors cutting black swaths through the haze. I was helping Nurse Reynolds prep the trauma bay when the first patients were rushed in. Multiple blast injuries, the paramedics shouted over the chaos. Third-degree burns, possible chemical exposure. But these weren't like any burns I'd seen before. The wounds seemed to shift and crawl under the bandages, and the flesh around them was marked with strange, geometric patterns that couldn't have been caused by any conventional weapon. The patient, a British tank commander, was conscious but incoherent, his eyes rolling wildly as we transferred him to the treatment table. "The smoke," he kept muttering, his voice raw and desperate. "There were things in the smoke. They were dancing. Oh God, they were dancing." Dr. Thompson took one look at the burns and his face went pale. His mismatched eyes widened, and for a moment, I thought he might step away from the table. Instead, he squared his shoulders and began barking orders. "Get me the sulfetazine silver and set up an isolation protocol," he commanded. "And whatever you do, don't let the wound exudate touch your skin." As I worked alongside him, I noticed the burns weren't healing normally under the treatment. If anything, they seemed to be spreading, the geometric patterns becoming more intricate. The patient's skin felt hot, not fever hot, but like metal left in the sun. More casualties poured in throughout the morning. Each case was stranger than the last. A Marine with percussion injuries that somehow left perfect hexagonal bruises. 3 soldiers from different units all babbling about voices in the radio static. A tank crew found wandering in the desert, their vehicle intact but abandoned, all of them speaking in tongues. It was around noon when it happened. I was checking on the British tank commander when he suddenly sat bolt upright in his bed. His eyes had turned that same pale, colorless blue as Dr. Thompson's damaged eye. "They're coming up through the ground," he said, but his voice wasn't his own. It was multiple voices speaking in unison, some deep and guttural, others high and keening. "The fires have awakened them, the old ones, the burning ones." His back arched impossibly, and the geometric patterns on his skin began to glow with a sickly green light. The monitors went haywire, showing impossible vital signs. Multiple heartbeats, brain activity that spiked off the charts. "Hold him down," Dr. Thompson shouted, rushing in with a syringe of sedatives. But the patient's skin was now burning hot to the touch, and where our hands made contact, those same geometric patterns began appearing on our own flesh. Nurse Reynolds started screaming. She was backing away from the patient's bed, pointing at the wall behind it. We all turned to look, and there, spreading across the concrete, were the same patterns that marked the patient's skin. They seemed to be growing, flowing like liquid geometry, forming shapes that hurt my eyes to look at. The power flickered, and in that moment of darkness, I heard it, the same backwards Arabic from the radio, but this time it was coming from the patient's mouth. When the lights came back on, he was unconscious. The patterns on his skin now faded to what looked like normal burn scars, but the marks on the wall remained. That night, during the shift change, Corporal Baker pulled me aside. The young medic's hands were shaking as he showed me his notebook. He'd been tracking the unusual cases, marking their locations on a map of the region, the pattern they formed. "Don't you see it?" he whispered, his eyes wild. "They're all coming from areas with active oil fires. And look at the dates and locations. They're spreading out in a spiral pattern from somewhere deep in the desert. Something's using the smoke as a conduit, Lieutenant. Something old, something that's been waiting." I wanted to dismiss his fears as combat stress, but I couldn't. Not after what I'd seen, not after the geometric patterns had begun appearing in my own dreams, pulsing and growing like living things. More patients arrived that night, the ward filled with the sound of their shared nightmares, dozens of voices crying out in languages that hadn't been spoken in millennia, and beneath it all, growing louder with each passing hour, was the sound of something scratching at the walls, trying to get in. Or maybe, I realized with growing horror, trying to get out. We discovered the basement purely by accident. Private Rogers was mopping up after a particularly difficult surgery when his weight caused one of the floor tiles to crack. What we initially thought was a minor structural issue turned into something far more sinister. The hole revealed a set of ancient stone stairs descending into darkness. "This wasn't in the building plans," Major Williams muttered, shining his flashlight into the opening. The beam seemed to be swallowed by the blackness, barely penetrating a few feet. The local authorities said this was just an old-school building. Dr. Thompson insisted on being part of the initial exploration team. I'd never seen him so agitated, his hands constantly running through his gray hair, his pale eyes seeming to glow in the darkness. "These markings," he said, tracing his fingers along the wall of the stairwell. "They're similar to the patterns we've been seeing on the patients." The air that rose from below was stale and carried a sweet, cloying scent that reminded me of the gangrene cases we'd treated. Our footsteps echoed strangely as we descended, somehow coming back to us seconds after they should have, as if the sound was traveling much further than the visible space would suggest. The basement level opened into a vast chamber that couldn't possibly fit under the school building. The geometry was all wrong. Ancient stone columns rose into the darkness, each carved with those same geometric patterns we'd seen spreading across our patient's skin. The walls were lined with niches, and in each one, "Dear God," Nurse Reynolds whispered, her flashlight beam illuminating what looked like clay jars. Hundreds of them. Some were broken, their contents long since turned to dust, but others remained sealed with wax and marked with symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. In the center of the chamber stood what could only be described as an altar. The stone surface was stained a deep brown, and the air around it seemed to shimmer like heat waves rising from hot pavement. Dr. Thompson approached it, drawn forward as if in a trance. "This is old," he muttered, running his hands over the symbols carved into the altar's base. "Pre-Islamic, maybe even pre-Babylonian. This was a temple once, but not for any god of healing." He turned to us, his face ashen. "This was a place of containment. They weren't trying to cure the sick here, they were imprisoning something inside them." Before we could process this revelation, a scream echoed through the chamber. Private Rogers had opened one of the intact jars. Inside was a scroll, the parchment so ancient it seemed to crumble at the edges, but the text was somehow still readable. As we watched in horror, the ink began to move across the surface, forming new patterns, new words. "Don't read it." Dr. Thompson lunged forward, trying to snatch the scroll away, but it was too late. Roger's eyes had gone glassy, and when he spoke, his voice had that same, multi-layered quality we'd heard from our patients above. "The burning ones rise again," he said, his voice echoing impossibly in the chamber. "The smoke frees them from their prisons of flesh and clay. They dance in the fires of man's warfare, growing stronger with each soul they consume." Rogers collapsed, the scroll falling from his nerveless fingers. As we rushed to help him, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The geometric patterns were appearing on his skin, spreading outward from where he'd touched the parchment, but these were different. They seemed to pulse with a faint light, and as I watched, they began to form images, twisted faces screaming in agony, bodies contorted in impossible ways. That's when we heard the footsteps from above, slow, dragging sounds punctuated by the sharp tap of what could have been claws on tile. Our patients were moving, but the rhythmic shuffle of their feet suggested they weren't fully in control of their movements. "They're looking for it," Rogers whispered, his eyes now the same pale blue as Dr. Thompson's damaged one, the anchor point. The place where the veil is thinnest. They've been waiting so long, trapped in their jars of clay and flesh, and now the smoke calls them home. The chamber began to vibrate, a low frequency that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The symbols on the walls started to glow with that same sickly green light we'd seen before, and in their illumination, I saw something that nearly shattered my sanity. The shadows cast by the columns weren't falling in the right directions. They were bending toward the altar, flowing like liquid darkness, and in their depths, something was moving. Something with too many angles, too many dimensions. Something that had been waiting for thousands of years for humanity to make the sky wrong again. We ran. God help us, we ran back up those stairs, like the hounds of hell were at our heels. But as we emerged into the hospital proper, we realized our mistake. We'd left the entrance open. The way down was no longer sealed. And in the darkness below, something had begun to climb up. The infection, if you could call it that, spread through the hospital like wildfire. It started subtly, patients developing the same pale blue eyes we'd seen in Rogers and Dr. Thompson. Then came the geometric patterns, appearing on skin that had never been burned or wounded. But it was the dreams that truly marked the beginning of the end. "They're all dreaming the same thing," Nurse Reynolds reported during an emergency staff meeting. Her hands shook as she reviewed her notes. "Every single patient describes a vast desert city made of impossible angles and black stone, and above it, 3 suns burning in a sky of smoke. I'd been seeing it too, though I hadn't admitted it to anyone. In my dreams, I walked those obsidian streets where the shadows moved against the light, and every reflection showed a different face. The air was thick with that same, sweet, rotting smell from the basement, and somewhere in the distance, something was always singing in that backwards language we'd heard on the radio. The first death came 3 days after we discovered the basement. Private Mitchell, one of our burn victims, began convulsing during routine bandage changes. The geometric patterns on his skin started shifting and flowing like liquid mercury, and then, he simply ceased to exist as we knew human existence. What was left in his bed defied description, a shape that hurt the eyes to look at, constantly folding in on itself in ways that shouldn't have been possible. We had to seal off the entire wing. Dr. Thompson became obsessed with the ancient texts we'd found below. He stopped sleeping, spending every free moment translating the scrolls we'd recovered. His office walls were covered in his frantic scribblings, diagrams of geometric patterns interwoven with what looked like anatomical drawings, though no human body had ever contained such structures. "Don't you see," he said when I brought him coffee one night. His pale eye was weeping a clear fluid that left faintly glowing trails on his cheek. "They're not causing disease. They're rewriting the fundamental architecture of human flesh. The geometric patterns. They're not spreading across the skin. They're spreading through dimensions we can't fully perceive." He showed me his translations, his hands trembling with manic energy. This place was an ancient containment facility. When plagues swept through the region thousands of years ago, they weren't just diseases. Something was using the infections to transform human hosts, to create bodies it could inhabit. The priests who built this temple found a way to trap these entities in physical form, sealing them in those clay jars we found. "But what does that have to do with the oil fires?" I asked, even as I feared the answer. "The smoke," he whispered, his voice cracking. "The ancient texts speak of the great darkening, a time when the sky would be wrong, when the barriers between dimensions would weaken. They predicted this, Lieutenant. They knew that one day mankind would make the sky dark again, and when we did," he trailed off, staring at something I couldn't see. That night, Nurse Reynolds reported seeing shadow figures moving between the beds in the ward. Not normal shadows, but things that seemed to peek out from angles that didn't exist, reaching out with limbs that bend in impossible ways. The patients who could still speak started talking about the burning ones, watching them from the corners of their rooms. We lost 3 more patients that week. Each death was accompanied by the same reality-bending transformation, leaving behind shapes that couldn't exist in our universe. The surviving patients began sharing not just dreams, but consciousness, speaking in unison, finishing each other's sentences, screaming together in perfect synchronization. The military sent an investigation team, but they found nothing conclusive. Their instruments couldn't detect the wrongness we'd all been experiencing, couldn't measure the way space itself seemed to bend around certain patients. They collected samples, took readings, and left with their reports and specimens. None of them made it back to their base. Their helicopter was found 3 days later, halfway buried in the desert sand. The cabin was empty, but the walls were covered in those same geometric patterns, and the pilot's last radio transmission contained only one word, repeated over and over in that layered, multi-voiced way: beautiful. Corporal Baker was the first staff member to show symptoms. I found him in the supply room, drawing complex geometric patterns on the walls with his own blood. His eyes had gone that pale blue, and his skin was hot to the touch, like metal in the sun. "They're calling us home," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the small space. "Can't you hear it? The song of angles and flesh, the geometry of transcendence. They've been waiting so long, trapped in their jars of clay and bone, but now the sky is wrong again, and they're so hungry." The patterns he'd drawn began to glow, and as I watched in horror, they started to move, flowing across the walls like living things. The air grew thick with that sweet, rotting smell from the basement, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear that backward singing growing louder. Baker turned to me, his face splitting into a smile that was too wide, too full of angles that a human mouth couldn't make. "Don't be afraid," he said. But it wasn't just his voice anymore. It was the voice of every patient in the ward, speaking through him in perfect harmony. "This is evolution. This is transcendence. This is what happens when the sky goes wrong and the burning ones return to claim what was always theirs." And then the power went out, plunging the hospital into darkness. In that blackness, I could hear them moving, all of our patients, all of our infected staff, their footsteps perfectly synchronized as they began walking toward the basement entrance, toward the altar that had waited so long for their return. The last thing I saw before I ran was Baker's face beginning to fold in on itself, his flesh rearranging into geometries that shouldn't exist in our reality. And as I fled, I felt the first hints of heat under my own skin, the first whispers of patterns beginning to trace themselves across my flesh. It was Dr. Thompson who finally pieced it all together in those last lucid moments before the geometry took him completely. I found his final notes scattered across his office floor, written in a frantic hand that grew increasingly abstract as the pages went on, the letters themselves beginning to twist into those impossible angles we'd all come to fear. "The plagues were never diseases," he'd written. "They were transformative agents, designed by beings that existed before humanity crawled from the oceans. The ancient Mesopotamians didn't build this temple to contain sickness, they built it to contain consciousness. The jars in the basement don't hold diseases, they hold minds, old minds, alien minds, waiting to reclaim the bodies they lost when the sky was first made right." The next page was stained with what looked like tears, but they'd left luminescent trails on the paper. The oil fires aren't just darkening the sky, they're burning the thin places between dimensions, creating gaps in reality that these things can slip through. The smoke carries fragments of their consciousness, infecting anyone who breathes it too long. In the hospital, God help us, the hospital is built on one of their ancient anchoring points, a place where the walls between worlds were already thin. I found Dr. Thompson himself in the basement chamber, kneeling before the altar. His body was barely recognizable as human anymore. His flesh had become a shifting mass of geometric patterns, his face a kaleidoscope of opening and closing angles. But somehow, he could still speak. "You need to know the truth," he said, his voice overlapping with others, creating a chorus of whispered revelations. "Humanity was never meant to be permanent. We're transitional forms, cocoons waiting to be split open from within. The burning ones, they seeded us with their potential millions of years ago, buried it deep in our genetic code. All they needed was the right conditions to trigger the change." He reached out with what had once been a hand, now a crystalline structure that moved like flowing mercury. "The Gulf War, the oil fires. It's not a coincidence. They've been whispering to us through history, guiding us toward this moment. Every major conflict, every environmental disaster, it's all been preparation for their return. The walls of the chamber had begun to pulse with that sickly green light, the geometric patterns flowing like liquid across the ancient stone, and in their glow I could see things moving in the shadows, shapes that shouldn't exist, beings made of angles and dimensions that human eyes were never meant to process. "Look," Thompson said, gesturing to the altar with his crystalline appendage. "Look at what we really are." The surface of the altar had become like a mirror, but what it reflected wasn't the chamber around us. I saw cities built from geometries that denied physics, streets that folded through dimensions beyond our comprehension. I saw beings that moved like living equations, their bodies constant calculations of space and time. And with growing horror, I saw human forms beginning to twist and reshape themselves into these impossible configurations. "The burning ones aren't invading," Thompson whispered, his voice now a symphony of overlapping tones. "They're waking up, and we're their chrysalises." A piercing sound filled the chamber, like crystal being struck at a frequency that could shatter reality. The air itself began to crystallize, forming geometric patterns that extended in directions I couldn't comprehend. And through it all, I could hear that backward singing growing louder, resolving itself into words that no human throat could produce. The infected patients had begun descending the stairs, moving in perfect synchronization. Their bodies were in various stages of transformation, some still mostly human, others barely recognizable as having once been people. They moved like a single organism, flowing down the steps in a cascade of shifting angles and impossible geometries. "You feel it too, don't you?" Thompson asked, and I couldn't deny it. The patterns under my skin were spreading, burning with a cold fire that felt like mathematical equations being solved in my flesh. The change is exponential. Each transformed body makes the barriers weaker, allows more of them to cross over. Soon, the whole region will be a chrysalis chamber, and after that, he didn't need to finish. I could see it in the altar's reflection, the transformation spreading across the globe. Humanity's flesh becoming the raw material for something older than biology, older than physics itself. The burning ones weren't just waiting to return. They were waiting to wake up inside us all. The evacuation order came too late. By the time military command realized something was wrong, half the hospital staff had already begun transforming. I watched Nurse Reynolds' final moments of humanity through the observation window of the isolation ward. Her skin had become translucent, geometric patterns flowing beneath it like luminescent circuit boards mapping the architecture of a new reality. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice harmonizing with itself across multiple frequencies. The complexity, the perfection of it all. We were so blind, seeing only 3 dimensions when there were always so many more. The patterns under my own skin were spreading faster now. Every heartbeat sent pulses of geometric light through my veins, and I could feel my consciousness expanding into spaces that shouldn't exist. The walls of the hospital seemed to flex and bend, revealing glimpses of that crystalline city I'd seen reflected in the altar. Major Williams organized a last-ditch quarantine effort. Those of us still mostly human worked to seal off the lower levels, welding doors shut and blocking stairwells. But you can't contain something that exists in more dimensions than you can perceive. They came through the angles. I saw it happen in the East Wing. Private Jenkins was standing guard at a sealed door when the corner of the room, the actual geometric intersection of walls and floor, began to unfold like origami made of reality itself. Something reached through that impossible opening, not a hand or tentacle, but a mathematical concept given physical form. Jenkins screamed as the geometry took him, his body rearranging itself according to theorems that violated every law of physics we knew. The other guards opened fire, but the bullets passed through spaces that didn't exist in our dimension, emerging from other corners to lodge in the walls. Dr. Thompson's journal provided one last revelation before the words literally crawled off the pages and burrowed into the walls. He'd discovered that the ancient priests hadn't just built this temple to contain the burning ones. They'd found a way to force them back into their higher dimensions. But the price was unthinkable. Mass consciousness collapse, he'd written, the letters pulsing with that same sickly light. They bound the burning ones by destroying the minds they were trying to inhabit. Hundreds of sacrifices, their consciousness shattered so completely that the geometric beings couldn't maintain their hold on our reality. The implications were clear and horrifying. To stop this, we'd have to destroy not just the bodies of the infected, but their actual consciousness. And with each passing moment, more of us were joining their transcendent hive mind. I found Major Williams in the pharmacy, loading syringes with a cocktail of sedatives and psychotropics. His eyes had already begun to fade to that pale blue, but he was fighting it, his hands trembling as he worked. "The chopper will be here in 30 minutes, he said, his voice fluctuating between frequencies. "But we both know they can't be allowed to leave this place. If even one of them reaches a population center." He didn't need to finish the thought. The patterns under my skin were burning now, rearranging my flesh according to geometries I was beginning to understand all too well. I could feel my mind expanding, connecting with the others, hearing that crystalline song that promised transcendence. A massive tremor shook the building. In the basement, something was happening at the altar. The infected were gathering there, their transformed bodies merging into configurations that hurt to look at. Reality itself was beginning to crack around them, letting things through from dimensions where the laws of physics were more negotiable. Major Williams handed me a syringe, his arm now more geometric pattern than flesh. "You know what has to be done. The consciousness collapse. It has to be total. No minds left for them to inhabit." I looked at the syringe, then at my own hands, watching the patterns swirl beneath my skin. The helicopter would be here soon, but it couldn't be allowed to land. Not when any one of us could be a chrysalis for something that could unmake reality itself. The burning in my veins was almost unbearable now. Through the windows, I could see the oil fire smoke had taken on that same geometric pattern, the whole sky becoming a vast calculation of space and time. The burning ones were so close to waking up, to remembering what they had been before they went to sleep in human flesh. I raised the syringe, fighting against the transcendent beauty trying to reshape my thoughts into crystalline perfection. There was only one way to ensure the geometry couldn't spread beyond this place. Only one way to put the burning ones back to sleep. The question was, did I still have enough humanity left to do it? They tell me I was the only survivor. The official report claims there was a mass contamination event, something about chemical weapons and shared hallucinations. They say I was found wandering in the desert 3 days after the hospital mysteriously burned to the ground, babbling about geometry and burning mines. The military doctors checked me over thoroughly, looking for any trace of the patterns I'd described in my debriefing. They found nothing, at least nothing they could see in the wavelengths of light their instruments could detect. I've been retired from service, given a generous pension and a carefully worded gag order. The whole incident has been buried under layers of classified paperwork and deliberate misinformation. As far as the world is concerned, Canadian Field Hospital Unit 16 was simply decommissioned after a successful tour of duty. But I know what really happened in those final moments. I remember the way the consciousness collapsing compound spread through the ventilation system, carried on air that had begun to crystallize with geometric patterns. I remember the screams, not of pain, but of transcendent loss, as hundreds of minds were shattered, denying the burning ones their chrysalises of flesh. I remember the way reality itself seemed to buckle and tear as they were forced back into their higher dimensions. The altar exploded, taking most of the basement level with it. The geometric patterns retreated, flowing back into angles that slowly resumed their proper shapes. And I remember the fire, not the oil well fires that had darkened the sky, but the cleansing inferno I started in the hospital's pharmacy, chemical flames that burned hot enough to erase any trace of the mathematical infection that had nearly transformed us all. The official story says I was lucky to escape. They don't know that I didn't escape at all, not really. The patterns are still there, under my skin. I can see them sometimes, when the light hits at just the right angle. They're dormant now, mathematical equations written in flesh, waiting for the sky to go wrong again. In my dreams, I still walk those obsidian streets where geometry defies comprehension. I see the burning ones, trapped once more in their crystal prisons, waiting for humanity to reach the stars and darken new skies. They're patient. They have to be. They've been waiting since before our species evolved, sleeping in our genetic code. The doctors say the pale blue tint in my left eye is just damage from smoke exposure. They say the geometric scars on my hands are from chemical burns. They tell me the dreams will fade with time and therapy. But I know better. I know because sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that backwards singing. It comes through the static on my radio, through the buzz of fluorescent lights, through the whisper of wind in empty spaces, the song of angles and flesh, calling us home to the geometries we were always meant to become. And somewhere in the desert, buried under sand and secrets, those clay jars still wait in their ancient chamber. The burning ones sleep fitfully in their prison of shattered consciousness, dreaming of oil fires and darkened skies. They're waiting for us to make the sky wrong again. They're waiting to wake up. And deep beneath my skin, in places that shouldn't exist, the patterns are waiting with them. Because the thing about geometry is this: it's all about patterns. And once you've seen the patterns that exist beyond our limited dimensions, you can never unsee them. You can only hope that when they finally wake up again, there will be someone left with enough humanity to burn it all down. Someone who remembers what we almost became. Someone like me.